Guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and it is seed starting time of year. And so today I am getting my space set up. Now I have two spaces where I start seeds. One is inside and one is outside. So whether you start seeds in a greenhouse outside or indoors, we've got you covered today. Let's go. If you want to learn more about my greenhouse, I have a whole separate video about that you can go and watch. I'll link that down below. You might have remembered my video from a couple years back where I showed my basement seed starting situation. So I'm gonna link that video below for those of you who are starting in a very, very dark place like a basement. All right, let's go. Okay, so here are the shelves that I use. There's always like random wool bits in my seed starting space. We'll talk about that in a minute. I like to use these baker's racks. So these are just the regular baker's rack. You can usually get them at like Costco or Lowe's, and they are metal. They have lots of space. So this is great for air circulation. And these shelves are also adjustable. So I can really determine based on whatever I have growing in here, if I have bigger pint pots or I'm potting things up, then maybe I can have some things that need a little bit bigger space. I can adjust these shelves up or down. So this is really, really nice because when I'm seed starting, like I mentioned, sometimes I'm starting in very tiny blocks and those tend to be about this tall. Sometimes I'm starting in the bigger blocks, they're this tall. Sometimes I'll start in, toilet paper rolls, those are that tall. So with these shelves, that can be adjustable. I use the same grow lights inside and outside. These are just LED shop lights from Costco. They are not fancy grow lights. You can absolutely use these to start and grow out plants perfectly fine. It's all about keeping them close to the top of the surface of the seedling. So if you're going to use shop lights, LED shop lights, you'll want the tops of the lights to be about this close to the seedlings, okay? So what I do is I put them on adjustable wire, and that way I can raise and lower them as the seedlings grow. You can also use chains to be able to raise and lower them. So I'll show you how I set those up, but I use the same thing inside and outside. Now, why do I need to have them on if I'm starting my seeds outside? It's pretty simple, really. It's because our daylight hours are still pretty short here in December, January, February. Still not getting quite the daylight hours that I need to get good seedling growth. So usually I have them on for about 16, 18 hours a day. So that means what I do is once the sun sets, so here it's about 4 o'clock, 4:30, that's when our sun is starting to go down. That's when I'll have these lights kick on. They stay on until about 10 p.m. and then they turn back off. So I'm just giving about 5 extra hours in the greenhouse. And then obviously once we get into later spring months and we have more sunshine, I don't have to do that anymore. Inside, I have them on a timer, again, for about 16 or 18 hours a day. And that's even if they're in a window. I'll show you how I'm gonna set up my lights. Typically, what I do is I'll do 2 shop lights per shelf. So one thing you want to pay attention to is what end all your plugs are on. What you don't want to do is set these up and then at the end try to be like plugging them all in and have all the plugs be on the wrong end. So what I usually do is I plug them in, and then that way as I go, A, I know that all the lights are still working from last year, and B, I know that the lighting configuration is going to be correct. So, but just for the sake of showing, I do 2 lights per shelf. So I put one in the back and one in the front. Could you get away with 1 light per shelf? Maybe, but I wouldn't recommend it. I don't think that's gonna be enough light, especially if you're using shop lights. So you can see this will give a nice array of light all the way across the entire shelf here. All of my seedlings are gonna get equal light, so they're all gonna grow equally as well. I'm going to assume that I'm gonna be starting little soil blocks here because I'm getting ready to start my Lysianthus, so that's probably what's gonna go in here. And I'm just gonna tie this up. Actually, let's start with the back one. So I'm just gonna tie this right onto my shelf above. So all I do is I take my wire, I lift this up to about the height I think it's gonna need to be, and then I just tie it off. You can see these are really easy to adjust. If I need to adjust up or down, all I have to do is untie that and lower it or lift it. Do the same thing with the one next to it. Ta-da! Okay, so we've got this shelf lit. Now down here, usually I don't start anything this low. There's a reason for that. We're outside in the greenhouse. So there are a couple things I have to contend with outside that I don't have to contend with inside. One of those is mice. Rodents potentially can easily get in and out of this greenhouse. It is certainly not airtight by any stretch of the imagination, so mice can get in here often. And what that means is anything that's on the ground, especially things like peas, they will nibble at. So I don't leave anything down on the ground. Now these, they really can't climb up these shelves, so anything that's up higher is safe. So I do use the space for things like storage, for my soil blockers, for bags of dirt, bags of vermiculite, just general tools that I might need in the greenhouse. Inside, again, you're not going to have to worry about that as much, although you might have something like cats, perhaps, that might like to eat your seedlings like mine. So do bear that in mind for that bottom-most layer. These lights have lasted me several seasons, but every season I do have some that go out. So it is always smart to check before you get your station all set up, because you wouldn't want to set it up based around some that are maybe out. So as you can see, I've got the same exact setup inside. So I mentioned you can go back and watch. If you don't even have a window, you don't have to have a window. It's okay. You'll just have your lights on for longer. I do have a south-facing window here, so I'm going to utilize that because any extra sunlight I can get is great. But I'm still going to go ahead and have my lights on in here for about 16 hours a day. I do use still my bagged Fox Farms potting soil. It's still the best peat-free option I found for seed starting. That being said, especially when I'm outside in the greenhouse, I like to keep the soil inside a different container. I don't like to keep it in the plastic just because I have so many concerns about microplastic leaching, and with the sun especially and the heat, that's when that tends to happen. So if you have an inside space, it's best to keep your soil inside, I find, because especially if you have a living soil, one that maybe is inoculated with something like mycorrhiza, then it can be best to keep it from being subjected to extreme temperatures and extreme UV rays. So I'm gonna go ahead and put all of my soil into a metal can, and then we're gonna keep it out of the sun and also somewhere where it can't freeze and thaw and go through lots of freeze-thaw cycles. So for me, I'm gonna keep my seed starting soil inside. The other thing I always keep with my soil is my sifter. So this is a 1/4 inch sifter. It fits right onto a 5-gallon bucket. That way I can sift my seed starting soil. So because this is potting soil, it's actually not a problem that it's too rich. That's not the issue for seed starting. It's that there's giant chunks in it, especially when we're talking about soil blocking. So if I sift it through my little sifter, and you've probably seen this in my soil blocking videos, then what I'm left with here are these big chunks. These are good for things like orchids, or I just usually honestly use them as mulch in my garden. But what I'm left with is this nice soil that's perfect for seed starting. So I always make sure I have those things close by. I'll probably do a big batch and just sift through a whole bunch of this at once so that it's ready to go as I am seed starting. So that's one thing that helps. If there's a nice day that's a little bit warmer, you can go ahead and do a big batch of your seed starting soil and have it ready to go for when you're ready to start your seeds. Now I optimize this space by soil blocking. I'll tag that video below as well so you can see how many we start in here in a general spring season. But small is on purpose. That way I can heat it and I don't spend $1 million doing so. There are pros and cons to both indoor and outdoor seed starting when it comes to heat. So obviously it's going to be easier to keep your indoor seed starting space nice and warm for your seedlings. However, that can also be a bad thing. So for example, when I'm growing out things like sweet peas or lisianthus or snapdragons, sometimes the indoor air temperatures, if it's in your living area and you're keeping it, 68-ish, sometimes it can almost be too warm, especially for sweet peas. Remember to go watch my sweet pea video if you're wanting to learn how to grow sweet peas, but we like them colder. So actually in January, I want my seed starting space to be a little bit cooler because it's reflecting what it would normally be going through in development in the early seed stage of these cold tolerant flowers. So everything I'm starting now is more cold tolerant. So that means they're gonna want a little bit cooler temperatures. I think hopefully that makes sense. So it's actually at this time of year a little bit easier to start in the greenhouse because it is cooler versus indoors it can be a little bit too warm. This is why a basement or even a attached garage, not necessarily heated garage, but an attached garage can be a nice space for seed starting. That's what my workshop is essentially, because It's not quite as warm as your indoor space, but it's still a little bit easier to temperature control than a greenhouse. So this is probably the biggest question that I get is how do I heat my greenhouse? This is a 6x8. There's a reason I use a small greenhouse, and that's because it's easier to heat than a huge one. I just use an electric heater. This is greenhouse rated. It's actually a greenhouse space heater. So that means it can hold up to a little bit of moisture. Now I wouldn't want to pour water on it, but it's okay if it's a little humid. And it's got a fan on here, so it has a couple settings. One is for heat and one is just for fan. So that's helpful because I can set it to actually I put this on a thermometer plug. So my thermometer plug will only kick on if it drops below a certain temperature. So usually so it depends on what I'm starting in here, but of course it's spring, I want it cooler. I only have this heater kick on really if it drops below 40. So I can set my plug so that it only turns on the power when it drops below 40 degrees. My space heater kicks on, and it can also serve as a fan if it gets too warm. I only really need one. If it gets very, very, very cold, like into the negative Fahrenheit temperatures, I might add a second one. Again, depending on what I'm growing in here. My sweet peas and things are fine down to like 16 degrees Fahrenheit, so not a huge deal. And I've had things freeze solid in here. My sweet peas have frozen solid and they've been just fine. But again, pay attention, keep a journal, write down all these things if you're trying to start outside so you know what your minimum temperature is when you want to start adding heat. Inside, of course, not so big of a deal, but really what you're trying to avoid is too warm if you're talking about growing inside. Heat mats are another way that we can help with that temperature issue. So the heat mats that I like actually come with this little thermostat, and so you can just plug this into your heat mat. You can tell it how warm you want it, and it will keep your heat mat at that temperature. That can be really helpful in an outdoor seed starting condition because this helps keep the temperature just right around where your seeds and your soil are at the right temperature versus trying to heat the whole greenhouse. So by using these heat mats, it can help keep my temperature where I need it to be, and I can tell it, adjust it. Some of them they just plug in and they're just one temperature. Don't buy those, it's a waste of money. Get these ones that have the thermostat so you can tell it what temperature for what seed you're starting at. So outdoor, I would say the outdoor growing situation, you need to be a little bit more hands-on. So if you're someone who's working in an office all day and you don't have time to like close and open your greenhouse door if there's weird erratic temperatures, then it can be tougher. That's when indoor seed starting might be better for you.
Remember, I have videos about all these different sizes, whether you're using the big 2-inch soil blocker or the medium 5-section soil blocker or the minis that make 20 at once. I use all of those for different situations. So you can go watch the video about which size soil blocker you want to use. I do also have this Johnny's, and then I also have the standing soil blocker, which I'll sometimes use, but it doesn't really fit that well in my trays. But they do make nice little blocks, as you can see. Now, like I mentioned, my trays are really easy to sanitize. These are the fiberglass ones. A few other things I keep on hand, my mosquito bits, or when inevitably, especially if you're starting inside and not in a greenhouse. Greenhouse, I don't really get them that much, but sometimes inside I'll get fungus gnats. I just sprinkle these over the top of the soil and I water them in once I start to see those fungus gnats pop up. This is BT. It actually will take up the larval stage of those fungus gnats, so I keep that. Of course, I'm keeping my mycorrhiza handy and my azospirillum and a rhizobia. So depending on what seed I'm starting, I keep all of these handy so that I can inoculate my seeds as they go. Remember, inoculating your seed is like giving it the best start for, you know, a nice healthy gut. So think of a gut microbe for your seeds. That's what these are for. Cinnamon I used to add it to my seed starting mix. I don't anymore because cinnamon is a natural antifungal and we're using mycorrhizal fungi. So we don't want to cancel out this fungus by using an antifungal. So I only use this if I absolutely have to. And the only time I really have to is if I get green algae growth. So green algae growth can be, really it's only detrimental if it's very, very thick because it can take the nutrients from your seedlings because it's a living thing. So it'll steal water and nutrients from your seedlings. So there's a couple ways you can take care of algae. One is making sure you keep a fan on in your space, but even then, sometimes seeds that need to stay very moist, like Lisianthus, are just prone to that green algae. So a sprinkling of cinnamon over the top surface of the soil will help.
Also, a sprinkling of vermiculite will work. So either one, what you're basically trying to do with that algae is suffocate it of light. So you're trying to keep it from being able to photosynthesize, and so you're starving it of the light. So cinnamon works really well, especially for smaller, tiny baby seedlings like the lisianthus, because the vermiculite sometimes can be too big and end up covering those little seedlings. So in that case, cinnamon. And I'll also use this if I have a seed that just needs a light covering of soil. Often I will use this vermiculite. Also helps with a little bit of moisture retention in my soil blocks. So I'll kind of sprinkle this over the top of my soil blocks after I put my seeds in, if it's a seed that needs just barely covered, if that makes sense. So, you know, things like basil or that actually need a little bit of light, but I want to help keep moist. Just a light scattering of vermiculite over the top is great for those seeds. So for those tiny little baby, little tiny seeds, so I just used a little toothpick, lick this tip of the toothpick, pick up my seed right into the soil block. That especially works well for tiny seeds like snapdragons. And then I've got my spray bottle for misting. So it's really nice if you have a lot of seeds that you have a continuous pump mister, but this works perfectly well for me. My hand does get a little bit tired as I go, but this is a glass jar, just because, again, anytime we're keeping moisture in a sunny location in a plastic container, it's going to leach plastics. And so if we're going to all this effort like I am to try to stay away from plastic in the seed starting space, then why not just use a glass spray bottle? All right, for mixing up my soil blocks, I am using my wood trays these days. So I used to use a plastic bin, but then of course with all of the scraping that happens with a soil blocker on the side of a plastic bin, I was just looking at research around, you know, cutting boards and that kind of thing, and how that can leach microplastics into food. And so I was like, well, if I'm going to all this trouble to soil block, then I should just use a container that's not that. A couple of other things I always have, just because I'm of course a weird seed starting type, is my wool bits. So for when I do start in my wood trays, which typically I'm not starting things until a little bit later in those wood trays, I'm starting things like my tomatoes and peppers in there that need a little bit more space. And then that's when I'm using my raw wool. So I've got a bag here of my raw wool. I have a bunch of my trays ready to go in different sizes depending on how many of each seed I'm starting. I have the bigger trays if I'm starting a lot, and the smaller trays if I'm only starting a few of something. And then of course I have my wool pellets. So I use the raw wool scraps when I'm doing the wood trays. But the wool pellets I use when I'm doing my soil blocking, and I mix that in. And that's because the pellets, you can see, are pretty broken up. So these mix into the soil block mix better. And I'm not gonna end up with a huge chunk of wool. It'll be more evenly dispersed throughout the soil blocking mix. The last thing I have, of course, in my seed starting space is my little calendar and a pencil, just because I know for myself, if I don't write it down immediately what I started and when, I'm gonna forget to do so later. So I just do it right when I'm starting everything, and that way I can go back and reference for next season when I started things and whether it was too early or too late, and I can adjust accordingly. So I've got that and my giant container of seeds. I'm not going to tell you guys again how I sort all of this, but I will link below how I sort it. So in case you want to know, you can go and watch that one, and that'll give you all the information on how I organize myself heading into seed starting season. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. It means a lot to us here. And this week we've got our next video of the next round of seeds I'm starting coming up.